Hey everybody. So last episode I talked about toy laser guns and the weird set of sounds they all seem to make. Now, while toy laser guns have run pretty much rampant across the world in the past 40 or so years, real laser guns thankfully have yet to become fully realized as a practical concept. Some prototype devices do exist, but even if a functional individual scale laser weapon did exist, it would almost certainly be a close-kept secret, highly impractical, overwhelmingly expensive, and quite possibly illegal in many ways. Speaking of which, have you guys ever heard of the CIA? Few government organizations around the world have managed to attain the notoriety that the Central Intelligence Agency has managed to acquire in the less than 100 years since its creation. And this isn't really a good thing. The CIA has infamously had its hands deep in just about every dirty affair you can possibly think of, to the point that the Wikipedia page for list of CIA controversies has been marked as, quote, needing expansion for a good year and a half. Domestic wiretapping, catastrophic human rights violations, violent coups in foreign countries, and more have pretty much become standard fare for the agency over many decades. But I'm not here to talk about that. Have you ever wondered what you'd get if you crossed unbelievable amounts of government funding, an almost complete lack of moral and ethical guidelines, and a bunch of government workers with seemingly nothing better to do? Well, for this season finale KRB mini episode, why don't we answer that?
Announced the official surrender.
This is a solemn but glorious hour. I wish that Franklin D. Roosevelt had lived to see this day. General Eisenhower informed...
We begin in the aftermath of World War II, when it became clear to the US government that a centralized hub for intelligence gathering and processing was needed in the event of future crises and catastrophes. The wartime Office of Strategic Services had been dissolved following the war's conclusion, and President Harry S. Truman was looking for an organization to replace it. While a number of governmental offices, including the FBI, were eager to assume the position, it was instead soon filled by an entirely new entity, officially designated September 18th of 1947 by the signing of the National Security Act. The Central Intelligence Agency was founded with the purpose of collecting and analyzing intelligence to further national security and preempt threats. Or so they said. Like I've said before, the agency's gotten into some pretty bad shit, but along the way there's been a lot of activity that can be classified more accurately as bizarre, pointless, ridiculous, or sometimes just insane. Let's talk about a few. The Cold War was a great time to be an intelligence agency. No shortage of enemies, be they real, theoretical, or imaginary, and just enough fear to justify pretty much any level of action. As a result, a lot of this stuff on this list comes from this time period, including, of course, Operation Gold. One of the CIA and its allies' most high-priority objectives was to spy on the higher levels of Soviet government. Unfortunately, this proved quite difficult, although it wasn't for a lack of trying. Operation Gold began in late 1953 on the outskirts of Soviet-controlled East Berlin, when it was reported by the head of the German Federal Intelligence Service that an important telephone junction was buried just a few meters underground near the border of American West Berlin. The goal was to tap this line and potentially gain access to confidential communications coming in and out of Soviet Army headquarters in the heavily protected Russian-controlled zone. But how exactly does one get access to an underground telephone line in an area you're not legally allowed to enter? Well, as the old saying goes, when in doubt, dig a hole. As part of a joint effort between the CIA and MI6, who bizarrely had some experience with this kind of thing, an intelligence gathering building disguised as a warehouse was constructed in early 1954 under the command of CIA operative William King Harvey. The plan was simple: make a warehouse with a comically deep basement, dig a shaft down to the level of the buried telephone wires, and then start digging towards them. By 1955, a massive cast iron lined tunnel nearly a quarter of a mile long had been burrowed underneath one of the most heavily guarded areas of Berlin, and after accidentally hitting a septic tank and having to evacuate at one point, the telephone wires were reached and undercover British spy master Peter Lunn completed the wiretapping process. The entire operation had cost $6.5 million, over $70 million adjusted for today's inflation, and it was paid for almost entirely by the CIA. But now that it was completed, it could potentially operate for years undetected, right? Well, no. As it turned out, the Soviets had actually known about the little strip mining operation from the beginning. George Blake, a KGB mole in MI6, had alerted the Soviets to the plan before it even started. Not wanting to reveal Blake's status, the Soviets made the decision to allow the tunnel to operate for close to a year. And although no particularly high-level communications were intercepted, a massive amount of unencrypted telephone calls were accessed and recorded. The Soviets finally decided to blow the lid on the operation in April 1956, and Operation Gold was subsequently both condemned and praised for its ingenuity. Although it was known from the very beginning, and despite the fact that it was quite literally just a giant hole, the operation did yield a surprising amount of intel and was generally considered a success. I promise you this will not always be the case. Moving a few years forward, we arrive at the space race, a period in time where the United States and the Soviet Union channeled their unhealthy rivalry toward each other by competing to develop spacefaring technology. As you may know, the USSR took an early lead with the launch of their Sputnik and Luna series of spacecraft, and at this point in the late 50s, the US was eager to get ahead in any way they could. And the CIA had a plan. They were going to heist a spacecraft. The Luna spacecrafts were of particular interest, being the first to leave geosynchronous orbit, and it just so happened that in 1959 the Soviets were putting on a worldwide exhibition showcasing their industrial achievements, including, coincidentally, what was suspected to be a partially functioning model of the Luna space vehicle. Several US analysts were able to determine rough information about the module, but this was not enough, and so the heist began. Investigating the Luna at an exhibition was ruled out as it was kept under heavy guard, so the plan was adjusted accordingly. Operatives would intercept the transport truck, swap out the driver, and escort the vehicle to an abandoned scrapyard. There, under the cover of night, they were able to remove the module from its crate and perform an almost complete disassembly of the entire craft, taking pictures and extensively documenting the Luna's construction. Once, when an electrical assembly with a seal had to be broken, a perfect replica of the assembly and seal were created by the local CIA station and put back into place. Before the night was over, the operatives completely reassembled the craft and its container, and by 7 a.m. the next morning, had it back on the truck and ready to be inspected and shipped out. While the module had been stripped of most components, the agency was able to gain a fair bit of information about its manufacture, and somehow this operation remained entirely unsuspected until information about it was declassified many years later. This remains probably one of the only known cases of a spacecraft section being heisted in the history of the world, and this is probably unlikely to change. Now, while we're still on the subject of aerospace, I want to touch on something that I just can't not talk about. It technically doesn't count since it was an Air Force operation and not a CIA one, but it's just too weird for me not to mention. In 1958, the US Air Force began a project in collaboration with Canadian aircraft manufacturer Avro. It was, at certain points, referred to as Project 1794, and its goal was the eventual production of the Avro VZ-9 Avro car, which, I kid you not, was a flying saucer. The VZ-9 was a perfect circle and ran by blasting air around itself in a ring, powered by a large turbine in the center. The original plan was for it to act as a high-performance, high-speed, and high-altitude air vehicle that could perform vertical takeoff and landing like a helicopter. Only a few working models were ever made, and while it was eventually abandoned in 1961 for being too impractical and not delivering on its promised specifications, it's still kind of bizarre that for those brief few years the Air Force had actual flying saucers in production, even though they didn't really fly exactly like they were supposed to. Anyway, back to the CIA. Overthrowing the Cuban government, and more explicitly, killing Fidel Castro, was in a way the CIA's holy grail for a good bit of time. It was sort of a Wile E. Coyote Roadrunner type of situation, with the agency executing a vast slew of increasingly bizarre schemes and plans and operations only to fail every single time. But of course this did not stop them from trying. Many of these were executed as part of Operation Mongoose, a Kennedy-era series of terror attacks and plots to off Castro and generally spread disunity throughout Cuba. But many more were executed after this point as their own operations of sorts. Let's run through just a couple, shall we? Some of these never made it past the planning stage, while others were actually put into action, although obviously none were successful. The Chicago mob was contacted early in the 1960s, with the CIA offering upwards of $150,000 to poison Castro via a mob contact in Cuba. While mob boss Sam Giancana did accept the job, it ultimately turned out to be unsuccessful, as the first Cuban contact backed out and Castro decided not to eat at the restaurant where the pills would be served. Later on, the agency dabbled in less subtle approaches. Playing on Castro's fondness for scuba diving, a number of plans, including a tuberculosis-infected diving suit and the colorful shell lined with explosives, were promised. Although its authenticity isn't entirely confirmed, one of the most famous schemes was the concept of assassinating Castro via exploding cigars, which he famously loved to smoke. Normal cigars, that is, not exploding ones. One of Castro's lovers, Marita Lorenz, was at one point contacted and told to carry out the hit, but she reportedly didn't go through with it. Explosive kills were commonly attempted, as were standard strike teams and various other poisoned items, including a pen. Some other schemes were aimed not at killing Castro, but instead embarrassing or discrediting him. These included spraying Castro with an aerosolized psychedelic while he delivered a speech, and lining his shoes with thallium salts, which would theoretically cause his hair and beard to fall out. A retired Cuban counterintelligence officer named Fabian Escalante estimated the number of schemes or attempts at over 600, executed throughout numerous presidential terms up until the 1990s, and quite possibly the 2000s. But these wouldn't all be for naught. Castro would die of natural causes at age 90 in November 2016, proving that time may very well be the greatest assassination method of them all. Or not. That sounds kind of stupid, to be honest. Let's get into some weirder stuff. Now, how exactly does one spy on enemy communications in a public place while remaining entirely undetected? The uninformed observer may very well think this is impossible, but the wisest among you, of course, will almost certainly think surgically altered radio cats. Operation Acoustic Kitty was a $20 million 60s-era spying project that involved just about what you'd think, performing a surgical procedure to implant a microphone and a radio transmitter inside an unsuspecting cat, and then letting said cat roam free in the vicinity of areas where supposedly covert conversations were taking place. The goal was for the cat to wander over, pick up information which could then be transmitted, and then wander off, leaving the victims of the spying completely unaware. The first real test of this concept supposedly occurred in the early 1960s, when one unfortunate feline subject was sent to spy on two men outside the Washington, D.C. Soviet embassy. Unfortunately, the cat was reportedly hit by a taxi almost immediately and wasn't able to complete the mission. And honestly, I feel really bad for it. The cat didn't ask to be made a cyborg, and it sure as hell didn't ask to be made a spy, so it's pretty sad it ended up becoming a casualty of the Cold War. However, differing reports also state that the project was instead abandoned before a test was even made, and that the cat had its implants safely removed and that it went on to live a fulfilling life. This is the one I'm going to choose to believe for now. But regardless of which is actually true, the project was soon after abandoned for being too impractical and unpredictable, and was officially cancelled in 1967, thankfully saving future cats from being turned into microphones. But it doesn't just end with the cats. Psychic phenomenon were something the CIA had a vested interest in for decades. Many of you have no doubt heard of MKUltra, the 2-decade-long project that aimed to develop brainwashing and interrogation techniques through extensive use of psychoactive drugs and psychological torture. But slightly less well known is the long-running Stargate project. No, not that Stargate project, although that would be pretty sick. In the 1970s, the US government began to believe their Soviet opponents were experimenting with psychic warfare, and to be fair, they weren't entirely wrong. Their response, of course, was to establish psychic projects of their own. Throughout the decade, a number of projects, including Scan8 and the Gondola Wish program, were founded largely with the goal of seeking out and enhancing the abilities of those claiming to be capable of remote viewing, essentially perceiving locations and events at long distances through the mind. Based at Fort Meade in Maryland, the project went through a number of names throughout the 70s, 80s, and even 90s as it sought out individuals, both military and civilian, who were believed to be capable of seeing things not ordinarily able to be seen. At one point in the 80s, the program even claimed to have methods to train ordinary individuals in remote viewing techniques. However, this could not last. The project had never really been taken seriously, and a number of unfavorable evaluations throughout its existence led to it being continuously downsized, supported by a few individuals in high government positions who remained confident in its efficacy, until it was eventually shut down for good in 1995. Final documentation provided inconclusive results as to whether or not the program had actually produced meaningful data, but it's interesting nonetheless. Now, we'll end off with a short but particularly insane one, separate from the Cold War because I'm honestly getting really tired of talking about it. In 2005, during the initial height of George Bush's War on Terror, the CIA got in contact with toymaker Donald Levine, who had famously oversaw the design and production of Hasbro's legendary G.I. Joe line of toys. The CIA's mission for Levine was simple: to create a lifelike doll of Al-Qaeda founder Osama bin Laden, which, when subjected to heat, would shed its face to reveal a red, demonic one underneath. Codenamed Devil Eyes, the eventual goal would be to disseminate these dolls throughout Afghanistan and Pakistan, where they would, according to the plan, frighten children and turn their opinions of their parents against Osama bin Laden. Shockingly, this is another one that never made it past the planning stage, but interestingly enough, 3 prototype models were indeed made by Levine, with 2 having been sold for thousands at auctions, and 1 suspected to be in CIA hands at this time. So, congrats to whoever managed to acquire these artifacts, and with this, we'll be done for now. Now, it might seem like projects and schemes of this kind are entirely a thing of the past, but you gotta remember, the only reason we know about them now is because, in many cases, it just took this long for them to become declassified. There could very well be just as many, if not more, horrific and insane programs at work as we speak, but we'll really have no way of knowing until they, too, become public knowledge. So until then, stay safe out there, guys. I hope you've all enjoyed this first season of mini-episodes. It was really fun to make, and you guys can look forward to a special feature-length bonus video coming in the not-too-distant future as well. And as always, thanks for watching.